We are not the first civilization on Earth. Here's the proof. Chapter 1. The Anomaly in the Andes. The mountain air in the Peruvian Andes held a silence so profound it felt like a physical presence, a weight of forgotten epochs pressing down on the small team of interlopers. For Dr. Aris Thorne, the silence was a welcome reprieve from the cacophony of academic skepticism that had hounded his career for a decade. Here, at an altitude that stole breath and clarity, was a chance for vindication, or perhaps just a beautiful final failure. The site, pinpointed by a satellite's algorithmic eye scouring for geological oddities, was not a known Inca ruin or a Spanish colonial relic. It was something else entirely, a geometric scar on the spine of the world, hidden in a treacherous basin where the clouds clung like ghosts. Aris led the way, his boots crunching on the scree, followed by Dr. Lena Vance, whose geneticist's mind saw patterns in everything from cellular structures to stonework, and Kai, their graduate student, whose fingers flew over a tablet, correlating GPS data with ground-penetrating radar feeds. They had left their local guides at the last village, their warnings about apunados, mountain spirits, still ringing in the thin air. What they found, however, was not the work of spirits, but of a precision that defied local history. A wall emerged from the mist, not of piled rubble, but of colossal polygonal stones, fitted together with a seamlessness that rejected even the blade of a knife. The joints were so tight, so unnervingly precise, they seemed less like masonry and more like a single, petrified entity that had grown from the mountain itself. This was not pre-Incan, it was pre-everything. Working for 2 days with brushes and careful trowels, they cleared a narrow, downward-sloping passage that had been choked with centuries of wind-blown soil. The passage led to a chamber, a perfect cube hewn from the living rock. The moment Kai's portable work lamp flickered to life inside, Aris felt the last of his professional cynicism evaporate. The walls were not bare, they were a library of stars. Etched with a tool of unimaginable fineness were constellations, spirals of celestial points connected by faint flowing lines. Lena immediately began capturing images, her breath pluming in the cold. Kai ran a preliminary software alignment. The result, whispered into the static charged air, was impossible. The map did not depict the night sky as it was now, nor as it was in the time of the pharaohs or the builders of Gobekli Tepe. It was a perfect snapshot of the northern hemisphere's heavens from approximately 25,000 years ago, during the last glacial maximum, an epoch when humanity was supposed to be hunting mammoths with spears, not charting the precession of the equinoxes on stone. In the center of that cube of ancient light, surrounded by a frozen memory of an ice age sky and holding proof of a technology that should not exist, Aris Thorne understood. This was not merely an archaeological discovery, it was a message, a single, cryptic sentence from a past so deep it had been erased from human memory. The disillusionment that had been his constant companion for years melted away, replaced by a chilling, exhilarating certainty. They were not just digging up history, they were uncovering a secret, and the shard in the wall, the silent, uncorroded metal, was the first word. Chapter 2, Beneath the Ice, Part 1. The metallic shard from the Andes, now sealed in a nitrogen-filled case in a Boston lab, had become a silent siren, its call impossible for Aris Thorne to ignore. The star map's date was the key, a temporal anchor pointing to an epoch of mile-thick ice. It was a climatologist, a reclusive figure named Dr. Elias Sorensen, who published under a pseudonym and lived off-grid in Norway, who provided the next coordinate. Responding to Aris's carefully worded inquiry about anomalous glacial melt patterns, Sorensen sent a single cryptic data packet, coordinates on the Greenland ice sheet, and a grainy radar image showing a perfect hexagonal shadow 2 kilometers beneath the surface.
The accompanying message was brief. The ice is a curtain. It is falling. Look now or never. 2 weeks later, the team found themselves in a world of blinding white and screaming wind, a landscape so hostile it felt extraterrestrial. Their base was a cluster of reinforced pods huddled on the ice like mechanical beetles, 100 miles from the nearest research station. The journey in, aboard a skeletal twin-engined plane that skied onto the glacial surface, had been a lesson in visceral terror, buffeted by katabatic winds that howled with primordial fury. Here, the silence of the Andes was replaced by a constant groaning conversation between ice and sky, the vast sheet settling and complaining under its own impossible weight. Lena, bundled in a high-tech cocoon of insulated fabrics, oversaw the setup of the ground-penetrating radar array. The equipment, specially modified by Kai to penetrate deeper and resolve finer details, looked absurdly fragile against the expanse. For 2 days, they dragged the sled-mounted sensors in a meticulous grid over Sorensen's coordinates, the bitter cold seeping through every seam, their breath freezing on their face masks. The raw data streams were a chaotic mess of subsurface layers, but Kai's algorithms, running on banks of battery-heated servers in the main pod, began to clean the signal. On the evening of the second day, the image resolved. It materialized on the main screen like a ghost from the deep. The chaotic strata of ancient snowfall and compressed ice gave way to something geometric, vast, and utterly deliberate. A sprawling radial pattern of straight lines and acute angles spanning nearly a square kilometer lay entombed on 19C4. It was not a natural geological formation. It was architecture. The structure's edges were sharp, its symmetry flawless, a frozen echo of the precision they had witnessed in the Andes, but on a scale that dwarfed it. The ice, they realized, was not just covering it, it was preserving it in a perfect crystalline sarcophagus. The decision to drill was made with a tense, unanimous urgency. The meltwater rivers carving blue scars on the ice sheet mere miles away were a ticking clock. Using a thermal corrosive drill bit designed for extraterrestrial ice sampling, they began the long, slow process of piercing the frozen chronology above the structure's central node. The drill whined, its progress measured in centimeters per hour, each layer of ice a page in a climate history book they were now burning through. After 18 hours of continuous nerve-shredding operation, the drill head breached a cavity. The core tube retracted, bringing with it a cylinder of ancient ice and, at its very tip, something that was not ice at all. It was a lens, roughly the size and shape of an elongated apricot pit. As Lena carefully extracted it from the core sample in the sterile lab pod, the ambient light from the overhead LEDs ignited it. It was flawlessly transparent, possessing a crystalline structure that seemed to gather light rather than simply transmit it, but it was the refraction that stole the breath from the cramped space. When Lena rotated it slowly over a black mat, the light passing through did not fan out into a simple rainbow. It fractured into spectra that had no business in nature, bands of ultraviolet and infrared visible to the naked eye, shimmering halos of color that seemed to phase in and out of perception, and a deep, resonant amber at its heart that pulsed faintly, as if holding a captured sunset from a forgotten world. Lena's hands, steady in their surgical gloves, placed the object into a portable scanning electron microscope. The machine hummed, building a nanoscale portrait. Her initial analysis, whispered to Aris and Kai, who crowded close, was a simple, devastating sentence. The atomic lattice was perfect, a symphony of silicon and trace elements arranged in a complex, three-dimensional fractal pattern that repeated with zero defects. It was, yes, a crystal, but one that had been grown, or rather printed, with a control over matter that spoke of a technology able to command the very building blocks of reality. It was not a found object, it was a made thing, an artifact, and as it lay there on the lab mat, spinning impossible light into the sterile air, the groaning ice sheet beneath their feet felt less like a foundation and more like the lid of a tomb they had just begun to pry open. Chapter 2, Beneath the Ice, Part 2. The alarm from the perimeter sensor was a shrill digital shriek that tore through the pod's insulated walls. Kai, who was monitoring the radar feed, jerked upright, his face illuminated by the red pulse on his screen. 4 heat signatures, moving fast and in coordinated formation, were approaching from the southeast. They were not the lumbering treads of a research vehicle. They moved with the lethal grace of snowmobiles. Aris's mind, fogged with exhaustion and wonder, snapped into a cold, sharp clarity. Sorensen's warning was a prophecy. They were not alone on the ice.
Chapter 3, The Bloodline Code. The storm of controversy began not with a shout, but with the precise clinical click of a laser pointer in a dim university auditorium. Dr. Lena Vance stood before a modest audience of geneticists and anthropologists, her face illuminated by the glow of a projection screen. The data displayed was deceptively simple, a series of gene sequence alignments, a forest of A's, T's, G's, and C's. But within that forest, highlighted in pulsating red, was the anomaly. Lena had named it the Pangeic signature, a set of non-coding DNA sequences, genetic dark matter that performed no known function, found in 2 geographically isolated, unconnected populations, the Tukuma people of the deep Amazon and the Niv communities of eastern Siberia. Her voice was steady, devoid of the theatricality that often accompanied revolutionary claims. She explained the methodology, the rigorous contamination protocols, the multiple verifications. The signature was not just present, it was identical across both groups, a genetic fossil preserved in perfect parallel. The kicker was the dating. Using mutation rate clocks, she placed the introduction of this signature into these human lineages at approximately 12,000 years before present. It was absent from all other global genetic databases prior to that temporal horizon. Her conclusion, delivered with quiet force, was that this was not a human innovation. It was an introduction. A signature from a divergent human lineage, a cousin species, woven into the genome of certain populations through interbreeding during the turbulent millennia of the late Pleistocene. A silent genetic whisper from a branch of the human tree that had supposedly gone extinct. For a moment, there was only the hum of the projector. Then came the polite probing questions, the requests for raw data, the murmurs of intrigued skepticism. Lena provided everything, confident in the bedrock of her evidence. She left the podium feeling the peculiar lightness that follows the unburdening of a secret long carried alone. The detonation occurred 48 hours later, orchestrated not in a lecture hall, but on a popular science podcast hosted by a provocateur with a penchant for debunking pseudoscience. The guest was Professor Alastair Hendricks, a towering figure in population genetics from a rival institution, a man known for his razor-sharp intellect and a withering disdain for what he termed archaeophantasy. He had obtained a copy of Lena's presentation. His dismissal was not a critique, it was an execution. Over the course of an hour, in a tone of patronizing finality, he dismantled her work for the listening public. He spoke of sample contamination in remote field conditions, of the well-known perils of sequencing artifacts in junk DNA, of the seductive, career-making allure of finding ghosts in the genome. He did not call Lena incompetent, he implied a tragic, wishful myopia. When you stare into the genetic past, hoping to see giants, he intoned, his voice rich with academic authority, you will inevitably mistake the shadows of your own equipment for their footprints.
This isn't science, it's a parable. The media, ever hungry for conflict, seized the binary narrative. Headlines blared, "Ghost species claim sparks genetics war," and "Did our ancestors bed with hobbits?" News segments featured split screens of Lena's calm, data-heavy rebuttals and Hendrix's dismissive, soundbite-ready scorn. The debate spilled from scientific journals onto social media, fracturing into a cacophony of partisan fervor. Proponents of alternative history hailed Lena as a brave truth-teller, while the mainstream scientific establishment largely rallied behind Hendrix, seeing in his skepticism a necessary defense of disciplinary rigor. In their shared lab, the atmosphere grew thick with a different kind of pressure. Aris watched Lena retreat into a deeper, more focused silence, her eyes glued to her screens, running and rerunning analyses, as if to find a single imperceptible flaw that would prove Hendrix right and grant her peace. But the data held. The signature remained, an unblinking red mark on the genome. Kai monitored the digital firestorm, his face grim. "He's not arguing the data," Kai observed one evening, the blue light of his monitor reflecting in his glasses. "He's arguing the story, and his story is simpler. It's always easier to believe in a mistake than in a miracle." The controversy became a prism, refracting their own work into a spectrum of public judgment. The Andean star map was recast as an imaginative misinterpretation. The Greenland lens was whispered to be a sophisticated hoax or a classified tech prototype planted to discredit them. The genetic signature was the keystone, and Hendrix was doing everything in his power to hammer it loose. Lena found herself isolated at professional gatherings, conversations dying as she approached, her once respected reputation now tinged with notoriety. Yet within the maelstrom, a few private, encrypted messages trickled in from other geneticists working on paleogenomes. They offered no public support, but their words were clear. "Your alignment is too clean for contamination. We've seen shadows of this in our Neanderthal introgression maps. Keep going." The signature, for all the public noise, was beginning to resonate in the quiet places where real science was done. It was no longer just a sequence of nucleotides. It was a litmus test for the boundaries of accepted history. Lena, staring at the elegant, confounding code on her screen, understood the true battle was not about convincing Hendrix, it was about outlasting him. The signature was real. It was a message in a bottle, written in the language of life itself, and it had washed up on the shore of the present, waiting for someone to believe it was more than just driftwood. Chapter 4: The Leak and the Backlash, Part 1. The pressure in the lab had become a tangible thing, a fifth element, thickening the air with dread and frustration. Professor Hendrix's public evisceration of Lena's genetic work had done more than spark debate. It had erected a wall of respectable skepticism, behind which their entire project was now trapped. The Andean star maps, the lens, the signature, each piece of evidence was dismissed as error, hoax, or fantasy when viewed in isolation. Aris watched his team fraying at the edges. Lena worked with a silent, furious intensity, chasing ever more complex validations. Kai, however, had grown still, his usual kinetic energy replaced by a cold, calculating quiet. He spent hours hunched over his terminal, not running analysis, but studying the architecture of information itself, how it flowed, where it bottlenecked, and how truths could be smothered by the very institutions meant to champion them. Aris knew the feeling. The university's administration, once cautiously supportive, had grown skittish. Emails from the dean's office requested clarifications and contextual frameworks, bureaucratic code for discomfort. Their funding, always precarious, was up for renewal in a month. Hendrix's influence on the review committee was an open secret. The corporate security team on the ice was not an isolated incident. It was a symptom of a world where discovery was a commodity and secrets were assets. The evidence they had was a key, but it was locked in a vault of their own making, surrounded by gatekeepers who had thrown away the lock's blueprint. Kai made his move on a Tuesday night, long after Lena had left, and Aris was dozing fitfully on the worn couch in his office. The alias Chronos Seeker was born in a cascade of encrypted hops through servers in jurisdictions with no data retention laws. The package was elegant and devastating. It contained no grand manifesto, but raw, curated data. The high-resolution scans of the Greenland lens with its impossible refractive indices and microwave waveguide properties. The full genomic alignment of the Pangeic signature with all its metadata and verification flags, and a single haunting overlay of the ancient Andean star map against the reconstructed Pleistocene sky. Accompanying it was a concise, anonymous commentary written in flawless, dispassionate academic prose, connecting the dots without drawing conclusions, allowing the data to scream for itself. He sent it to The Empirical Watchdog, a notorious independent scientific blog run by a collective of retired researchers with a reputation for ruthless integrity and a disdain for institutional politics. They published it in full, without redaction, at dawn in their European time zone. The viral cascade was instantaneous and tectonic.